So that was, I guess that one was, those two sessions were a little bit more like, the slideshows that we've looked at in the sort of the big first round of webinars. And then we then sort of did, I guess we sort of took three phases in the sort of our chats with the coaches in the other sessions. And, so we wanted to find out a little bit about them. And so really what we're just going to, summarize, is the common ground that there was between them. Because that's, I think, is what we can, what we can take from in terms of like our own coach and own development. So everybody there was an experienced coach. They've been doing it for some time, and they're successful. In some cases, they're successful with global medalists, successful in, for example, moving people along the pathway. So, we've recognizing that, importance of the work that's done, all the way through that pathway from young athletes all the way through to finding out how good you can be. We talked about, sort of one of the questions asked was like, what's your sort of your background, your kind of your sort of education in athletics. And so everybody had a coaching license. That's, obviously that's really important in terms of, demonstrating sort of skills and competencies. It's also important in terms of things like professional standards, and safeguarding as well. So, the athletes that we engage with on these, our England programs, they need to be working with a licensed coach. So that was important. And that's probably part of the reason that they were, that was an important reason that they wouldn't have been invited on without that. But yeah, they'd all got that, they got their coaching license. But I think what was really evident was that license was not the end point. And that licenses have different levels. We sort of sometimes number them and relate them to numbers. Once you got your sort of level 1, level 2 coach, that was not the end of the journey. That's probably just the start point, the jumping off point. And then it was interesting to talk about, how they continued their development. And what was, clear is that they'd not done this alone. Somebody had encouraged them to get into coaching, and they probably in many cases still maintain a relationship with that individual, possibly formally as a mentor or perhaps informally, but we perhaps would recognize the relationship as a sort of a mentoring, nurturing relationship that they still held, still really valued that. So that was clear. It's clear that they'd made a big impact. And we talked to them about, building on that, we talked about how, who was making an impact on them and who did they sort of look to, as a great coach. And some picked out, very much event specific coaches. So other racewalk coaches, but also from other event groups, or indeed other sports as well. But certainly from other event groups. And again, I think if we look at where we're at with our program in the UK, very much the England program, and all the sort of the work that I'm part of, and I think the coaches on the webinar who are tuning in today, we're part of a track and field program, rather than sort of in our little world of just the race walk event group. And I think that was apparent from talking to the coaches. They were engaging with and looking at coaches from other event groups. I mean, obviously endurance, especially. Chris had some of his library with him. that was interesting. The Arthur Lydiard's text and the like, and and likewise, I mean, that just we just sort of came back around to so we'd asked them how they got involved in coaching. Like we said, probably somebody had asked them to ask them for some support and some help, or suggested that they get into coaching. I remember in Verity's case, being as young athletes, being offered that opportunity to take a coaching course, and then sometime down the line start to put it into practice and develop. But we did ask them a little bit about their philosophy, and it seemed quite common that was about they really wanted to help people get the best out of themselves. Being distinct from winning medals and breaking records. Okay, clearly some of those things. A number of the coaches have achieved those things, but there's probably a message in there in terms of that distinction between sort of the extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And it's quite, we set ourselves some quite extrinsic goals in terms of high performance. I want to get on this team, or I want to see if I can get on the podium. But I think when we then look at the performers who actually go and do achieve those things, they have that massive sort of intrinsic motivation to, they just sort of take joy in actually the whole sort of training process and just finding out how good they can be. So, and that was, clearly apparent in the coaches, and hey, we have a massive influence, coupled with a responsibility. So that was evidence in sort of looking at sort of their background and how they got into all of this. And then we looked at how they developed themselves as coaches. As I said, getting the coaching license was perhaps the jumping off point rather than the end point of a coaching career. And so we picked out how they'd gone about improving themselves. And what was clear there was that working with other coaches, talking to people, was learning from them, learning from the athletes that they coach as well. So there's some collaboration involved there in developing yourself as a coach. And I guess that's why we're chatting away this evening. And some of you are a very long way away from the UK. So and this might be the one of our opportunities to learn from each other. And technology we have available today perhaps allows us to do that in a different way to generations previously. So certainly about sort of building like creating a bit of a network of support there. And I did ask if the coaches thought that they had a responsibility to develop themselves. I'm not sure if they'd really thought of it as a responsibility, but I think they all recognised that they clearly did continue to develop themselves. So they're living and breathing CPD, and they could all recognise some things that they felt that they wanted to work on and keep progressing with. They're all humble people, and that was apparent to me, and that the fact that everybody recognised that yes, there's we don't know it all, and there's lots of areas that we can develop in. Be that sort of in things like strength and conditioning, and that we had looked at a bit of video of that a few minutes ago. Or just understanding their performers, better, so that that in turn gives a better coaching experience. And again, we sort of said, what would their advice be to the developing coach, and what areas of study would they recommend? I think the areas of study were probably the areas that they found as their perhaps were their sort of work on areas themselves. But the advice was certainly about working with people and talking to people. And I think my thoughts on that, we lost a great coach, in the last year. George Gandy was, is sort of synonymous with the whole setup at the University of Loughborough in the UK, which is where British athletics have their performance base. And George has had huge success as a coach, working with lots of Olympic and world medalists, distance runners, in terms of advice to sort of developing coaches. I had the opportunity to have be on a lot of training camps and a lot of teams with George. Worked with us on the race walks at the 2012 Olympics. But George I like the expression where he distinguished experts from gurus. And he described the expert coach, which is us, as somebody who was continuing to learn and to prove. So they weren't standing still. So they were continuing to stretch themselves and try and learn new things, and then bringing new things into the coaching environment. Whereas the guru coach was had ceased to learn, and they now sat and waited for people to come to them, and then they shared their experiences of their day, probably. So I think what we saw was we saw expert coaches in our webinars in recent weeks, and great to see. And our final section was some reflection, which is the title of our title of this evening's session. So the first question I asked in terms of their reflections was about their career highlights. What was their high point thus far? And a couple of people had some great success, so that was perhaps quite quite easy to pick out. But but perhaps the answer was not not necessarily what we'd have expected in terms of a big medal winning performance. So I think what was also clear is that sort of the pleasure taken in, as we've said a number of times, seeing people get the best out of themselves, and how they developed, and that. So that was, that was clear, and that's certainly one of my reflections from, all of the various sort of lockdown phases that we've experienced. Very much sort of missing working with athletes at some of the times. I've been fortunate to be able to work with them through the programs that I'm, employed in. So some of the athletes, for a lot of perhaps a lot more time than others, it's been a little bit more of a normal experience. But you just miss working with people, and I think that's our sort of shared experience of the last year or so. As perhaps sort of has really brought that home, I think. And then we asked them to think, the coaches to think, would they change anything? If because hey, we all make loads of mistakes, but I don't recall, just going back through the notes, that there was really any any desire to go back and change something. So we learn from the work that we do, and perhaps it's better to apologize for something you did rather than something that you didn't do. But I think that's the mark of. That's why I wanted to get those particular coaches on, because we're all human, they could recognise that. Sure, they probably made plenty of mistakes along the way, but in terms of saying that they wouldn't really change anything, I think that sort of shows that they recognise that might not have enjoyed it at the time on some of them, but that they they'd learned and they'd grown from some of those experiences. And then we finally sort of gave them the question of, right, well, who else should we get on and interrogate in one of these sessions? And so a few coach names were mentioned. So they're on the list of people that we perhaps want to talk to in the future. And one really interesting take from Verity was to talk to talking to some of the current athletes. What she meant from that was some of our sort of current younger performers, who've perhaps not hit the headlines. So I thought that was a great idea. And that's something to have a look at for later in the year when we come back with some of these sessions and the sort of development work picks up again. And but that was certainly something that I hadn't considered. I think if you've been on some of the earlier webinars, I've done a lot of work together with. I work closely with she's a colleague, coaching colleague at the Talent Hub, Helen Clitheroe, and Helen she manages the steeplechase program. So it's the parallel program to this race walk program that I work on, and so some of the webinars that Helen has hosted. She's talked to athletes who, were perhaps competing at a high level. Were making Olympic Games teams in, perhaps the 1990s and the early 2000s. So they're perhaps, have retired in recent years, and they can sort of have a career to reflect on. And the pair of us, we were chatting about that, and we've probably got quite a gap there in the race walk group in the UK, as we don't have a generation that that fits that. And for example, in 2004 was the first time that we didn't have a British athlete in the Olympic Games in the race walk event group. So, and that's probably part of why we've got this whole program going and our whole setup with our program in Leeds, which is part of the Talent Hub setup. I'd kind of like, left alone rather than talking to current performers. Probably didn't have any that. I think the fairly recently retired athletes can relate to the current generation, so I'd possibly dismiss that. So that was something that's a big reflection for me. There's something to learn from. I'm going to work with Verity on that to get that going for some of our future sessions.